Page 223. 1. Is the basic narrative mode mimetic, M-I-M-E-T-I-C, mimetic within quote, or diegetic, D-I-E-G-E-T-I-C within quote, question mark. Janet discusses this matter in Chapter 4, Mood. Mimesis means showing or dramatizing. The parts of a narrative which are presented in a mimetic manner are dramatized, which is to say that they are represented in a scenic way with a specified setting and making use of a dialogue which contains direct speech. Mimesis is slow telling in which what is done and said is staged for the reader, creating the illusion that we are seeing and hearing things for ourselves. By contrast, diegesis, D-I-E-G-E-S-I-S, means telling or relating. The parts of a narrative which are presented in this way are given in a more rapid or panoramic or summarizing way. The aim is to give us essential or linking information as efficiently as possible, without trying to create the illusion that the events are taking place before our eyes. The narrator just says what happens without trying to show it as it happens. Footnote 3. Footnote. As Janet points out, page 162, the distinction between mimesis and diegesis was originally made by Plato in Book 3 of the Republic. So, as with Aristotle, contemporary narratology has roots in classical Greek philosophy. Back to text, para. In practice, of course, writers use the two modes in tandem, moving from mimetic to diegetic and back again for strategic reasons. This is partly because an entirely mimetic novel would tend to be infinitely long, and an entirely diegetic one could hardly be more than a couple of pages and would read like a plot summary. Of course, there are single-scene short stories which are written almost entirely in mimetic mode. For example, many by Ernest Hemingway, such as Heels Like White Elephants, which is a single take, T-A-K-E, account of an American couple waiting for a train at a remote Spanish railway station. Their thoughts, words, and actions as they wait reveal the crisis in their relationship. We see what they do and hear what they say, and that is all. Footnote 4. In Ernest Hemingway, The 549 Stories, Arrow Books, 1993. Back to text. But the longer structure of a novel usually requires a blending of the mimetic and the diegetic. Page 224. And the following brief passage illustrates the glide, G-L-I-D-E, between the two modes. Indent. For 5 years, Mario took the same route to work every morning, but he never saw Thelma again. Then one morning something very strange happened as he came out of the tube station and began to walk up Charing Cross Road. It was a bright, sunny day and ... indent closes para. The first sentence is diegesis, a rapid summary of a long sequence of events, but all taking place off stage as it were. Clearly, it would be impossible to move a plot along efficiently without passages of this kind. The remainder of the passage is mimesis. Having fast-forwarded, the writer slows down again at the next crucial scene and begins to construct it for us, telling us about the weather that day and the exact location, so that we see the scene in our mind's eye. Mimesis and diegesis need each other and often work together, so that the join between them can be difficult to discern exactly, but it is easy to see how fundamental they are as the building blocks of narrative. Number 2. How is the narrative focalized? Para. Focalization, discussed in pages 189-94 of Narrative Discourse, means viewpoint or perspective, which is to say the point of view from which the story is told. There are many possibilities. For example, in external focalization, the viewpoint is outside the character depicted, so that we are told only things which are external or observable. That is what the characters say and do, these being things you would hear and see for yourself if you were present at the scene depicted. In the opposite, internal focalization, the focus is on what the characters think and feel, these being things which would be inaccessible to you even if you had been present. Thus, the sentence, quote, "Thelma stood up and called out to Mario," unquote, is an externally focalized representation of this moment, for you would see and hear these things if you were present when they happen. By contrast, consider the sentence, quote, "Thelma suddenly felt anxious that Mario was not going to see her and would walk by oblivious on the other side of Charing Cross Road," unquote. This is an internally focalized representation of her. It reveals her unspoken thoughts and feelings which you could be completely unaware of even if you were standing next to her. Page 225. If the story is told throughout mainly with this internal focalization on Thelma, then she can be called the focalizer, Focaliser, of the tale, or the reflector in another tradition of narratological terms. Though she is not telling her own tale in the first person, readers are being given the events from her point of view. Thus, for instance, Elizabeth Bennet is the focalizer or reflector of Pride and Prejudice. Sometimes a novelist will freely enter the minds and emotions of more than one of the characters as if privy to the thoughts and feelings of all of them. This kind of narrative can be said to have zero focalization. This occurs when no systematic conceptual or perceptual constraint governs what may be presented, as Gerald Prince elegantly puts it in his A Dictionary of Narratology, University of Nebraska Press, 1987. Prince says that zero focalization is characteristic of traditional or classical narration. Its more familiar name is omniscient narration. OMNISCIENT within quote. Number 3. Who is telling the story? Para. Of course the author is, but not necessarily in his or her own voice or persona. One kind of narrator, the kind that often goes with a zero focalized narrative, is not identified at all as a distinct character with a name and a personal history, and remains just a voice or a tone which we may register simply as an intelligent recording consciousness, a mere telling medium which strives for neutrality and transparency. Such narrators may be called covert, effaced, EFFACED, non-intrusive, non-dramatized. We may impatiently insist that it is simply the author speaking to us directly, but it is worth remembering that this is not in any case the author's true voice, since he or she only uses this precise tone, pace, degree of detail, and so on when narrating a work of fiction. If we met the author at a party or in a bar, we wouldn't be able to tolerate this narrative style for more than a couple of minutes. Hence, it makes sense to think of this kind of disembodied narrator as an authorial persona rather than as the author in person. Para. The other kind of narrator is the kind who is identified as a distinct, named character with a personal history, gender, a social class position, distinct likes and dislikes, and so on. These narrators have witnessed or learned about or even participated in the events, page 226, they tell. They can be called overt or dramatized or intrusive narrators, examples being such tellers as Mr. Lockwood in Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights, Marlowe in Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, and Nick Carraway, Nick, Carraway in Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby. These dramatized narrators can be of various kinds. The heterodiegetic, heterodiegetic narrator is one who is not a character in the story he or she narrates, but an outsider to it, as Mr. Lockwood is. For example, heterodiegetic means roughly other telling, since the story being told is that of somebody else. By contrast, the homodiegetic narrator is present as a character in the story he tells. Janet, page 245, as Jen Eyre is, for instance. Homodiegetic means roughly same telling, SAME-TELLING, since the story being told is the narrator's own. Notice that first-person narrators may be either heterodiegetic or homodiegetic, since they may be telling someone else's story rather than their own. Omniscient narrators are necessarily heterodiegetic. The above concerns are discussed in Janet's chapter 5, Voice, under the subheading Person. 4. How is time handled in the story? Para. Narratives often contain references back and references forward, so that the order of telling does not correspond to the order of happening. Sometimes the story will flash back to relate an event which happened in the past, and such parts of the narrative can be called analeptic, from analepsis, analepsis, which literally means a back, BSCK, take, TAKE. Likewise, the narrative may flash forward to narrate, or refer to or anticipate an event which happens later. Such parts of the narrative can be called proleptic, from prolepsis, PROLEPSIS, which literally means a fore, FORE, take, TAKE. For instance, in D.H. Lawrence's short story, The Prussian Officer, a bottle of wine is split as a meal is served, and this gestures towards or hints at the bloodshed, which will end the tale. Charles Dickens has a similar anticipating moment at the start of A Tale of Two Cities, when a barrel of red wine split in the street anticipates the bloodshed which will be caused by the revolution. These are proleptic details, and they indicate in a slightly crude way how analepsis and prolepsis are often important in establishing and foregrounding themes in a story. Typically, writers make strategic use of both analepsis and prolepsis in telling a story, for the beginning is seldom the best place to begin. Stories tend to begin in the middle, in medias, MEDIAS, RES in italics, as the theorist of classical times said, with analeptic material sketching out what went before, page 227, and proleptic devices hinting at what the outcome will be, and thereby engaging the reader and generating the basic narrative momentum. These matters are discussed in Janet's first chapter, Order, ORDR, under the subheading Narrative Time. 5. How is the story packaged? Para. Stories are not always presented straight. Often writers make use of frame narratives, also called primary narratives, which contain within them embedded narratives, also called secondary narratives. For instance, the main story in Henry James's The Turn of the Screw is embedded within a frame narrative of a group of people telling ghost stories round the fire in a country house at Christmas. One of the stories told by one of the guests in these circumstances is the one which forms the substance of James's tale. Notice that here primary narrative really just means the narrative which comes first rather than the main narrative, which in fact usually isn't. The secondary narrative is the one which comes second and is embedded into the primary narrative. The secondary narrative is usually the main story. Thus, in James's tale, we first of all hear about the group assembled for the country house Christmas. Then we hear in a far longer narrative the story which was told in those circumstances. Likewise, the main story in Conrad's Heart of Darkness is embedded within the frame narrative of a group of former deep-sea sailors telling yarns as they wait for the tide to turn. Janet calls the embedded narratives meta-narratives, meta-narratives. He says the meta-narrative is a narrative within the narrative, footnote 41, page 228. So, for instance, the individual tales of Chaucer's, the Canterbury Tales, which are embedded within the frame narrative of the pilgrimage to Canterbury, are meta-narratives, that is, tales within a tale. Para. It is possible, too, to go a little further and subclassify frame narratives as single-ended, double-ended, or intrusive. A single-ended frame narrative is one in which the frame situation is not returned to when the embedded tale is complete. This is the case with The Turn of the Screw. When the story of the governess and the children has been told, we do not return to the frame situation, the Christmas Ghost story setting, to hear the reaction of the listeners. Clearly, the frame is single-ended in this case, because if we went back, page 228, to the fireside group, many of the crucial ambiguities which are the essence of the tale would have to be explained or debated. So, the frame is single-ended for very good strategic reasons. By contrast, the frame narrative in Heart of Darkness is double-ended, meaning that the frame situation is reintroduced at the end of the embedded tale. Thus, when the tale is over, we return briefly to the group of listeners to whom Marlowe, the dramatized narrator, has been telling the tale of his experiences in the Congo. Of course, Conrad doesn't attempt to solve or elucidate the enormous moral dilemmas which have been the substance of the tale. He merely reintroduces some of the imagery of half-light and surrounding darkness which has been prominent throughout, so that the double frame is used to give a kind of reinforcement to the thematics of the tale. Para. Frames finally can also be what we might call intrusive, meaning that the embedded tale is occasionally interrupted to revert to the frame situation. This too happens in Heart of Darkness, when Marlowe interrupts his own telling for a moment and makes the famous remark, quote, "Of course, ... you fellows see more than I could see then. You see me, whom you know, ... unquote." This reminds us of the limitations of viewpoint to which all storytelling is subject, and shows Conrad's distance for the traditional narrating stance of zero focalization, that is, omniscient narration. He has deliberately chosen a narrator whose outlook has distinct limitations, and the intrusive passage goes on to stress the darkness and isolation of the listeners. Quote, "It had become so pitch dark that we listeners could hardly see one another," unquote. The unnamed recorder, who will later write down Marlowe's story, voices the moral unease which the tale provokes, and seems to speak for us as readers, reminding us of the kind of alertness and guardedness which readers need. Quote, I listened on the watch for the sentence, for the word, that would give me the clue to the faint uneasiness inspired by this narrative that seemed to shape itself without human leaps in the heavy night air of the river," unquote. Penguin edition, edited, Robert Hampson, page 50. Again then, it is clear that the author uses an intrusive frame for strategic reasons, seeming to insert at this point a kind of alienation device, which deliberately breaks the spell of the narrative, reminding us of its moral complexities, so that we do not simply become uncritically engrossed in reading, page 229, it as an adventure story which happens to have a colonial setting. 6. How are speech and thought represented? Janet discusses this matter in his mood chapter under the subheading Narrative of Words. Various options in this area are open to the writer. The easiest option is to present speech which is, quote, direct and tagged, unquote, like this. Indent. What's your name? Question. Mario asked her. Stop. It's Thelma, comma, she replied. Indent closes. This is direct speech because the actual spoken words are given inside the inverted commas and the tagging is the name for the attached phrases which indicate who the speaker is. As in Mario asked her and she replied, the speech can also be presented direct and untagged like this. Indent. What's your name? Thelma. Indent closes. Clearly, this option might become confusing if more than two characters are engaged in conversation or if the exchange is not simply a sequence of questions and answers. So the preferred option might be, quote, direct and selectively tagged, unquote, like this. What's your name? Asked Mario. Thelma. Here the tagging is selective because the first utterance is tagged with asked Mario but not the second. There is no she replied or equivalent. The differences may at first seem slight, but each inserted tag is a reminder of the presence of a narrator and therefore tends to blunt the edge of the mimesis, edging the showing back towards telling. Another option is that of tagged indirect speech like this. Indent. He asked her what her name was and she told him it was Thelma. Here the speech is in reported form so that we are not given the actual spoken words. For instance, he actually said, what is your name? He didn't say what was her name. Also, the tagging is integral, so to speak. In other words, he asked her and she told him are not separated from the utterances but run into them. Page 230. This way of reporting speech seems to introduce an element of formal distancing between the reader and the depicted events. The distancing effect is perhaps slightly reduced by the final option, which is the use of free indirect speech like this. Indent. What was her name? It was Thelma. Indent closes. Again, the speech is reported or indirect, which is indicated by the switching of verbs from the present tense to the past tense, so that is becomes was, etc. The effect of this style is quite subtle, and one of its advantages to the writer is that it seems to suit an internationally focalized narrative, since it seems natural to glide from it into recording the thoughts and feelings of the speaker like this. Indent. What was her name? It was Thelma. Thelma, was it? Not the kind of name to launch 1,000 ships. More of a suburban lace-curtain sort of name, really. Indent closes. Here the musings on the name are clearly those of the male who has asked the question rather than the overview of an omniscient narrator. But the narrative can also move easily from free indirect speech in the other direction, giving external indications of actions and reactions. Hence, it can be a usefully flexible tool for the writer. Para. Genet's terms for representations of speech in a narrative are actually slightly more generalized than those just described, envisaging three layers, which get progressively further away from the actual words spoken as follows. 1. Quote, I have to go, unquote, I said to her. Mimetic speech. 2. I told her I had to go. Transposed speech. 3. I informed her that it was necessary for me to leave. Narratized speech. Para. As Janet says, page 172, transposed speech isn't quite the same as free indirect speech. To be precise, it's direct, but it isn't free, since it has the declarative verb I told, which is a form of tagging. The essential difference between transposed and narratized speech is that the former allows us to deduce the actual form of words used, I have to go, whereas the latter conveys the substance of what was said, but not the actual verbal formula, which could have been, I have got to go. or I am obliged to go, comma, I have no option but to go, etc. Page 231. Effectively, this converts living speech into narrated event and interposes the maximum distance between the reader and the direct impact and tone of the spoken words. Section joined up within quote, narratology. The material discussed in this chapter gives you a kind of basic narratological toolkit. Firstly, we have the crucial distinction between story and plot, which alerts us to question of how the narrative is designed and indeed what designs it might have upon us. Secondly, Aristotle's categories tune us in to some of the deep-lying psychic fundamentals of narrative. Thirdly, Propp's system provides data for considering some of the surface specifics of plots. And fourthly, Janet's material directs our attention towards how the story is told, how it sets about achieving its designs. We might add finally that the 5 codes of Roland Barthes, which we considered earlier in the book, pages 49 to 58, can be used as a supplement to all these, for if Aristotle is mainly focused on theme, Propp on plot, and Janet on narration, then Barthes's can be said to focus on the reader, for it is the reader's decoding which makes sense of all of the factors that narratives bring into play. Taken together in a kind of strategic blending, all these can provide a joined-up form of narratology, in which the aspects of narrative which may be glossed over in one system can receive their due attention from one of others. Section Stop and Think. One of the most striking aspects of narratology is the way it tends to provide several different terms for the same phenomenon, each one the creation of a different school. See, for instance, zero focalization and its equivalent term, omniscient narration. We might say that this is of little significance, since the English language has always had a layered vocabulary with several different available words for the same concepts. Thus, the Old English word blessing has an Anglo-Norman synonym, benison, B-E-N-I-S-O-N, page 232, and the Latinate equivalent benediction. The 3 words each have their own flavor. Blessing is plain, benison a bit showy and archaic, and benediction distinctly churchy, C-H-U-R-C-H-Y. Likewise, the terms currently most in vogue in narratology have a distinct academic tone, being drawn from layers of the vocabulary which derive from Greek and Latin, like mimesis and diegesis, for example, rather than from the more reassuring Old English strata. It is very noticeable that the writers themselves who began to discuss the theory of writing from the 19th century onwards tended to prefer very plain terms. George Eliot and Henry James, for instance, spoke of showing and saying rather than mimesis and diegesis, and E.M. Forster in his book, The Art of the Novel, liked to use homely terms which seem to declare their meanings very openly, such as his flat and rounded characters, without any attempt to impress us with their technicality or learnedness. Is it possible to offer a convincing defense of the narratologist's liking for learned-sounding terms? Para. This is, of course, a personal matter, and you should try to frame your own response to this question. Here is mine. I think the learnedness reflects the narratologist's greater distance from the actual telling of stories, and that it is ultimately due to the fact that they are not usually creative writers themselves. This is in line with the fact that the language used by practitioners about an art or craft tends to be very down to earth, for practitioners display their everyday familiarity with the craft by not using technical language. Thus, a musician may be described by outsiders as a violinist, in an orchestra but may tell you in conversation that they play the fiddle in a band. In other words, the learned tone of narratological terminology is to be expected, since it reflects a certain distance from the craft itself. But it hardly ever seems just an empty attempt to impress, and there's an attractive concision, concision, and precision about these terms, especially in contrast to the much looser way terminology is used with post-structuralism. Page 233 section, what narratologists do. 1. They look at individual narratives seeking out the recurrent structures which are found within all narratives. 2. They switch much of their critical attention away from the mere content of the tell, often focusing instead on the teller and the telling. 3. They take categories derived mainly from the analysis of short narratives and expand and refine them so that they are able to account for the complexities of novel-length narratives. 4. They counteract the tendency of conventional criticism to foreground character and motive by foregrounding instead action and structure. 5. They derive much of their reading pleasure and interest from the affinities between all narratives rather than from the uniqueness and originality of a small number of highly regarded examples. Section Narratology and Example. We will use Edgar Allan Poe's tell, The Oval Portrait, again, Appendix 1, and try to give an impression of how the joined-up narratology just mentioned might look in practice. The 4 basic areas outlined will be considered: the plot/story distinction, Aristotle, prop, and Janet, but in an integrated way rather than in sequence, and with no attempt to use all the categories we have discussed. Effective use of literary theory is nearly always selective rather than comprehensive. We will omit Bardiz's quotes since these are looked at in Chapter 2, and since these were looked at in Chapter 2. Para. The distinction between plot and story is immediately apparent in the way the event in the tell are related to us in 2 blocks which are presented in reverse chronological order in the plot. We first hear of the Civil War, the narrator's wound, his taking refuge in the castle, and his discovery of the portrait. Subsequently, we are given the story of the life of the woman in the portrait, which must actually have happened many years before. Had the events been told in chronological order, the effect would have been very different, and page 234, the transition would be more difficult to manage than here, where the officers picking up the book provides a natural seeming link. Para. These 2 blocks of the story are, of course, the primary or frame narrative, the part concerning the wounded officer, and the secondary or embedded narrative, the part concerning the circumstances of the portrait. We now have these more technical terms to describe what was mentioned more straightforwardly in Chapter 1 as the story within the story. It is notable that frame and meta-narrative are usually balanced. Usually the frame is tiny in comparison with the embedded narrative. Emotionally too, there is a kind of implied equivalence between them, so that the narrator's wound and the denotation of his processes of perception seem to have an almost equal weighting to the tragic story of the squandering of a young life. Perhaps there is the implication in the first part that the setting is a whole country which has been ravaged in the mistaken pursuit of some ideal, a kind of large-scale equivalent of what we see in the embedded narrative. Para. This raises the issue of what the frame is actually for and answers by saying that it is a way of giving resonance and wider applicability to the themes of the embedded narrative. But the frame is a delaying device, the role of which is to evoke a certain mood or atmosphere, like the overture played before an opera. If the story had been a folk tale or a fairy tale, generic conventions would have dispensed with the frame, and the story would begin, quote, There was once a young and talented artist, ... unquote. Again, the effect would be very different. The frame we can also add here is open-ended. We don't go back to the officer and valet at the end, so that the story ends with the climactic moment of the artist realizing that his wife is dead. Clearly, a double-ended frame would risk dissipating the dramatic impact of this, and in any case, the narrator would have to make some kind of moralizing comment, perhaps along the lines that sometimes the human price of great art can be too high, the effect of which would surely be bathetic, B-A-T-H-E-T-I-C. Para. The Propian material is surprisingly fruitful in the case of this example, a way into it being to suggest that the pathos of the embedded story lies in the way it conflates two archetypal fairy tale motifs, the first being the tale in which a princess is captured by an ogre, O-G-R-E, or villain imprisoned in a tower and perhaps incapacitated, paralyzed, page 235, or put to sleep by some magical agent. Subsequently, she is discovered and rescued by a hero, who then marries her. The other motive this tale seems to play with is the Bluebeard myth of the suitor, who is actually a serial monogamist and a serial killer, with the bodies of previous brides stored in his dungeon. So in Poe's tale 2, the bridegroom is already married, quote, having already a bride in his art, unquote, and is about to kill his bride. So with the kind of conflating of roles mentioned by Robert Scholes, hero and villain are the same figure, and the magical agency of art, the hero's artistic talent which should enhance life, instead becomes its destroyer. Notice here that we are freely adapting props function 14, quote, the hero acquires the use of a magical agent, unquote, to the rather different focus of Poe's tale. Para. Turning to Janet's categories, we can say firstly that both primary and embedded narratives are mainly mimetic, but it is clear that there are degrees of mimesis. The opening, as far as the words, quote, a remote turret of the building, unquote, retains a degree of generality. For instance, when the valet, quote, ventured to make forcible entrance, unquote, to the chateau, the phrase has an element of the generalizing touch usually found in telling rather than showing. The phrase is slightly narratized, that useful term of Janet's, that is packaged into narrator speak so that we don't actually see what is happening. Did the valet smash the lock with an axe, or shoulder the door repeatedly till it gave way, or run at it using a broken sundial as an improvised battering ram? Or did he just break a ground floor window with the butt of his rifle and climb in? Clearly, all these phrases would give full mimesis, as we might call it, so that we would see what is happening, whereas making forcible entrance is a phrase which gives only a partial mimesis, leaving the actual method still a secret of the narrators. Para. The description of the room from its decorations moves closer towards full mimesis. The decorations, quote, reach yet tattered and antique, unquote. But what exactly, when we stop to think about it, are decorations? What precisely are the manifold and multiform armorial trophies? Are they shields, swords, helmets, suits of armor, or what? How many are there of each, and where exactly are they positioned? Well, this kind of mid-mimesis, let's call it, doesn't precisely say, for its job is not to pan slowly round the room like a camcorder, but just to give us a series of vivid impressions of the nature, page 236, and atmosphere of the room. Full mimesis is reached with the paragraph beginning, page 236, quote, but the action produced, unquote, when the pace of the telling is slowed further and matched to the sequence of the officer's impressions. So we get very precise stage directions which place us exactly in the officer's position so that we see with him, so to speak, and have the illusion that the events are happening before our eyes. The story then remains in full mimesis until the officer picks up the book and the embedded narrative begins, and that too goes through the same stages from partial to mid to full mimesis. Para. The focalization of the two narratives is also of interest. The frame narrative is first-person homodiegetic, told to us by an overt or dramatized narrator who has a distinct personality and life history, which we can deduce from the details of the story, even though we do not know his name. He is educated. He knows the 18th century Gothic novels of Annie Radcliffe, is aware of painterly techniques like vignetting, vignetting, and seems to have a strong interest in the processes and stages of the act of perception, and he is obviously well-to-do. He has a valet, for instance. The narrator of the embedded narrative is more problematical. The small volume found on the pillow, which purported to criticize and describe the unusually great number of paintings in the room, suggests that he is what would now be called an art critic or connoisseur, connoisseur, but we know nothing else about him. He is, we presume, a heterodiegetic narrator, not part of the tale he tells, but the source of his information after the period when there were admitted none into the turret is difficult to guess. Either he is an omniscient narrator who assumes the privilege of entering and constructing the mind of his subject, or else he has some deeper intimacy with the painter. Perhaps he is the painter. Certainly we can assume that the unusually great number of spirited modern paintings on the walls are all painted by the same artist, since they are all evidently in the same style, and perhaps each of them was produced in similar circumstances, each costing the life of the sitter, in a compulsively repeated primal scene in which art and life struggle together for supremacy. Interestingly then, these at first technical speculations about the nature of the narrator seem to lead quickly to the deepest levels of content. Para. This brings us to that underlying Aristotelian level, the hamartia. The scene or fault which motors the whole story is, of course, the moral blindness of the talented artist who elevates himself to godlike status, taking on the role of creating life but being able to do so only at the expense of life. He lacks both insight, knowledge of himself, and foresight, being unable to see the inevitable outcome of his creative obsession. Curiously, for an artist, he also lacks empathy and imagination, and so cannot reproduce the real thing, only a simulacrum, simulacrum, a kind of spooky hologram from which the essence of the person is quite absent. The moment of self-recognition or anagnorisis, anagnoris, comes too late, since he never has the thought, quote, she is dying, unquote, only the belated perception, quote, she is dead, unquote. The peripeteia, or switch in fortune, is perhaps relevant to both characters, for the male figure changes from being an artist of high renown and becomes a vampire murderer, while the woman is at first a kind of embodiment of the energies of the life force itself, and then becomes the meekly yielding victim whose erotic appeal consists of listlessly allowing her life to be drained away. The fate of most of the women in Poe's tells. Para. So, approaching the story through these mainly technical narratological categories does seem to open up new avenues which do indeed suggest how meanings are constructed in narratives, at the same time as having the spin-off bonus of giving us new ideas about this particular tale and its well-known thematic territory of the conflict and contrast between the claims of life and the claims of art. Section Selected Reading. Bal, B-A-L, Mike, M-I-E-K-E, Narratology, Introduction to the Theory of Narrative, University of Toronto Press, 2nd edition, 1997. Originally written in Dutch and first published in English in 1985, this book quickly became a standard text. It has the precision, concision, and clarity which typify narratology at its best. Like all the important works in the field, this is not a massive tome, can be read through with pleasure or used as a concise encyclopedia of narratology. Cohan, C-O-H-N, Stephen, and Shires, S-H-I-R-E-S, Shires, Linda M. Telling Stories, a Theoretical Analysis of Narrative Fiction, Routledge, 1988. Covers narrative across the whole range of contemporary cultures, film, advertising, and so on. Plenty of useful material, though rather austerely written. Page 238. Janet Gerard, Narrative Discourse, Basil Blackwell, 1972. Janet's 5 chapters on order, duration, frequency, mood, and voice are the source of much contemporary thinking in narratology. It would help if the many subheadings were printed in the rather minimalist list of contents, but the excellent index makes up for the deficiency, facilitating the kind of encyclopedic use which is important in this field. Herman David edited The Cambridge Companion to Narrative, Cambridge University Press, 2007. Useful chapters on story, plot, and narration, time and space, character, dialogue, focalization, etc., in a collection which aims to cater for, quote, readers coming to the field of narrative studies for the first time, unquote. Onega, Susanna, O-N-E-G-A, S-U-S-A-N-A, and Angel, Joes, edited Narratology, Longman, 1996. An excellent collection, it stresses the mutual influences of narratology and deconstruction, feminism, psychoanalysis, and film and media studies. Prince Gerald, A Dictionary of Narratology, University of Nebraska Press, 1987, contains the briefest and mostly pithy, P-I-T-H-Y, definitions. The little book is strikingly Catholic in its representation of the various narratological sects. Whatever I want to know is in narratology, this is usually my first port of call. Rimman, R-I-M-M-O-N-K-E-N-A-N, Slomith, S-H-L-O-M-I-T-H, Narrative Fiction, Routledge, 1983. Can seem a little daunting, but this pioneering work is extremely wide-ranging in spite of its brevity. Page 239, Chapter 13, Eco-Criticism.